Chapter 11. After High School Part 4, Fall Term 2014 and Spring Term 2015. The fall of 2014. On the Monday of August 25th, I started working at Eros, a work rehabilitation center in Karlshamn right south of Oldham for people with various disabilities, as well as similar problems like mental illness or simply inability to work. I worked there for years, longer than any other place, even Brentis, mainly with carpentry and painting, just like the Irishman, haha. At first I've worked there all 5 days a week, 9 to 11 a.m. But then on the Friday of December 5th, I started working at 4 Sound again, which now had moved to a different building since early February 2014. I worked there the same hours on Wednesdays and Fridays while continuing at Eros on the side. 4 Sound went bankrupt in February 2017, so then it became only Eros. Since I finished work 11 already, I could easily go to Dragon every day during August and September, but then I gave up in early October. I had considered it for about 1-2 weeks after having scrolled through my entire Facebook newsfeed for like the 5th time. Back in these days you could scroll back through all the previous years with every single post. Previously, I'd always been satisfied with it, but now for the first time ever, I realized a lot of things I had said and done had been wrong through the years. That made me want to be more by myself, in combination with old age that was about to catch up. That in combination with me working only 2 hours a day led to some kind of emptiness, not unlike when I first left my parents' house. That in combination with working at a place quite alike Eros Hodder as well as 4 Sound once again made me really feel like I've landed back to how it all started 3 years ago. The difference now was just that now I had a much better grip on myself. I had a much better grip on my past, present and future. I could enjoy my new freedom a whole lot more. Then it was also that I during mid-October completely stopped listening to Alex Jones, cold turkey, after having listened to him pretty much 24/7 for about 4.5 years. The big turning point came with the Ebola scare and that it turned out to be a hoax, despite him and his crew having talked and written about it a lot. At first I thought they were consciously lying, but now I believe they made the exact same mistake as me, as I shared videos and articles about it constantly, but in this case rightfully so. I was far from alone in Umeå about worrying about the Ebola, but unlike COVID and even the swine flu, nothing came out of it. It was to begin with a huge relief to know life would go on like usual after having truly believed this time that the entire world would go under before New Year, not to forget all the anxiety over such a painful death, inner bleedings and shit. I also felt much freer after having stopped listening to him. It almost felt like I had quit smoking. From then on I mainly listened to hip-hop, but I also had a lot of complete silence, and thus more concentration on work, plus one or another documentary. I also realize how much I'd fallen off in my development, or better yet how far I'd managed to catch up now. I had become both more youthful and mature. I somehow got back my lost youth and at the same time entered adulthood for real. I also stopped walking around downtown every Friday and Saturday noon after having done so regularly since May 2008. I started getting bored out of just being around a bunch of people without meeting anyone I knew, or not being able to hang with them since they were usually busy. The Ebola scare also became a factor since I had skipped some rounds in order to decrease the risk of catching the flu. Already before this, I knew that rule number 1 is avoiding masses when there's a flu in the air. But what really made me change this fall was that I bumped into a racialized woman downtown sometime during late August. We talked for about 5 minutes and then kept going on Facebook. She gave me her number and also suggested I would invite her for dinner at my crib, which never happened though. She also suggested twice that we would meet, which never happened neither. I'd been a little interested in this woman for the last few months and expected something to happen between us if we met. I'd known her for years and I'd met her a few times at random for the last few months, but this is the time when things started happening. I was quite right there. Consequently, I became somewhat more religious. Actually, I'd felt some kind of godly presence for about 5 years after having learned about the Illuminati, but this was something different. Then the Saturday of November 8th became real special, just to say the least. I was walking around the east side of Ersbuda for about an hour at noon after having left like 8 books at the library at Folkets Hus, which I borrowed downtown the last summer. The downtown library was being moved, so therefore, I could borrow how many books I wanted for several months. It had recently snowed a little, so I appreciated it lightening up the otherwise dark fall, even though it would only last for about 1-2 days. I had also recently gotten myself an Instagram account, quite obvious why now, haha. I also managed to come up with numerous rhymes from scratch, about 6 weeks after having recorded my very first song written from scratch named just that, written from scratch. A lot of these lyrics were recorded only 1-2 weeks later. Right then and there, I became unexpectedly euphoric, or better yet, I became so just when I woke up. It was like I had smoked an entire kilo, that's about 2.2 pounds. I became almost psychotic. The street narcissism kicked in, quite like exactly 2 years before then, when I stopped eating pork and bought that chain. This reminded me strongly of the shifting euphoria I got to experience during the spring of 2011, when I fantasized about getting a girlfriend and converting to Islam. Well, now it pretty much became physical reality, and I didn't need to change my childhood for that. I also started imagining a movie like Future, like 5-10 years ahead, both regarding this woman and all other aspects of life. I became, quote, the ultimate gangster, again, but at the same time I became so humble and peaceful. My heart turned into a waterfall of pure love and hope for the future. What I had experienced before was nowhere close to this level. I felt totally saved and cleansed, by God. I got back a lot of old survival instincts from high school combined with new experiences and lessons. I became determined like never before, but now it wasn't about hating the ASP class or anything else. It was just pure love for this woman. I got it well confirmed that love is much stronger than hatred, which would later turn out to be for better and worse. Consequently, I cried happy tears and sweated heavily for a few days. I had never tied myself to a certain religion officially so far, but then and there, I finally decided to officially become a Muslim, after having been a, quote, halfway Muslim, for about 2 years. Now I could no longer go halfway. Now I was fully determined to fight until the end to secure a potential future with this woman. It was really like suddenly going from a frog to a prince. It felt like Islam was totally meant for me all along. Ever since I was 18, I'd predicted I would convert in the future, much thanks to Malcolm X and then learning about the Illuminati. Plus, I had refrained from pork for pretty much exactly 2 years by now. I'd also refrained from tobacco my whole life, and even alcohol since June 29, 2013. I never drank much before then neither. I also went through the Deen show entirely during the summer of 2011, and then I borrowed the Quran from the library during the last winter. I'd also participated in some Palestine demonstrations during the last summer as a reaction to Israel attacking Gaza. I easily picked up on all these companies we were supposed to boycott, most of which I already refrained from by default since it was mainly sweets and clothing brands. All of this surely brought me towards Islam. But it wasn't just about this woman. I saw heavy opportunities on all other fronts also, meaning my own life and all other relationships. It wasn't just about cred but also going deeper into this hood lifestyle, finally getting a simple answer for what I'd actually been searching for all these years. Then when it came to this woman, it wasn't just her, meaning we'd known each other for years and that we'd been chatting lately, we hadn't done any more than that so far. It was also her circumstances, her childhood, relatives and close friends. I came to the conclusion then that that was what I'd been missing for all these years and now I saw the perfect opportunity to fix everything. I felt like that made us fit perfectly. Only Allah could paint a better plan for me, I thought. I was baptized in church but grew up in an atheistic family. My first real contact with religion at all was most likely when I listened to Malcolm X when I was 16-17. Then during November 2009 when I got to learn about the Illuminati, I felt like there has to be a devil, and thus a God. While studying the Illuminati, I got to learn a whole lot about religion, especially Christianity and Islam. Alex Jones, who's a Christian, has also had a strong religious influence on me, and rightfully so. It's only tragic that I in the long run, or perhaps even in the beginning, let him become a bit too much like the prescription drugs he warned against. Then when I got depressed during 2011, I became more religious in nature. Every time I contemplated suicide, I feared ending up in an eternal fire, literally, as a consequence. Life already felt like an eternal hell as a punishment for past mistakes. That's what I wanted to escape, not stay stuck in forever. I also became euphoric and hopeful now and then I really didn't want to burn/rot in hell 24/7, with no escape. As I learned more about my past, I concluded that all these important events in my life which had been helpful in my development towards normality was part of God's plan for me. When I was falsely diagnosed at age 3, which resulted in me going to a special needs class instead of a normal class during elementary, that was God's will. Then when I switched teachers in 5th grade, ran away from school and got that hip-hop assistant, that was God's will. Then when I got snitch threatened by that guy in 7th grade and became the black sheep in the ASP class, that was God's will. Then when I got backstabbed by those girls, which made me decide not to lie about my childhood, plus made it easier for me to relate to hip-hop, and much more, and rewrite all these lyrics, that was God's will. Maybe it wasn't God's will or plan what decisions other people made, I thought, since that was their own choices. But if so, it was God's will or plan that I would make the best of it and grow from it, instead of remaining untouched or getting destroyed by it. Now when looking back at these events, I couldn't deny God's existence. God gave us all free will and free choice, but I also believed He had a hand in these important events, with a predicted outcome for us. But now since we got free will and free choice, it's always up to us to make the best of our circumstances. That's the main purpose of God's plan. God helps those who help themselves. And as much as I believed in an eternal heaven and an eternal hell after death, we all get a fair taste of both as a punishment/forewarning and reward well before death, as a direct consequence for our actions and sometimes even others, as well as a confirmation that we ain't just gonna rot in the ground after death. This life ain't always so different from the next after all, and I believed in all this long before becoming a Muslim. But since then, I've had the similarities and differences between both lives much increasingly confirmed. I've always seen ASP as the devil's work, which it truly is considering how it affects those who have it. I had also learned that the Illuminati poisons vaccines with mercury, which causes autism in small children born without any disability. But God managed to turn it to my benefit during my early childhood thanks to my false diagnosis and then switching teachers and so on and so on. Then when it comes to my lifelong lust for revenge, or better yet striving for justice and respect, I've been quite confused about this when it comes to religion. Since far back, I had known that forgiveness is an important aspect of most religions, especially Christianity. But at the same time, my lust for revenge made me more religious actually, because it gave me a reason to live, a higher purpose to fight for. It made sure I didn't become indifferent and complacent, nor brainwashed by all this quote, worry-free, Illuminati music. Malcolm X also had a strong influence on me at 17 already. Much thanks to him, as well as Muhammad Ali, I had always associated Islam with quote, keeping it real, an eye for an eye, struggle and revolution. But on the other hand, I'd always been quite negative about Christianity, not so unlike Malcolm himself actually. I used to associate Christianity with giving up and turning the other cheek like a punk, much due to Malcolm's harsh criticism of Christianity and even Martin Luther King. He called him a house slave and stuff, accusing him for trying to lead blacks into slaughter like sheep, while Malcolm encouraged them to take up arms and defend themselves by any means necessary. But then when I learned about the Illuminati, I instantly became more positive about Christianity, much thanks to Alex Jones and his aggressive tone, realizing it wasn't necessarily much different actually. I realized this even more when I later in life discovered that too many Muslims actually are way too cowardly and afraid of conflicts, at the expense of me and so many others. But on the other hand, I became later way too prone to conflict, beefing with just about anyone over small things. Islam made me realize my mistakes there and the difference between that and my old beefs. I didn't quit everything. Instead, I only became better at doing things, thinking more relatively. The beef with those girls taught me very well not to beef with just about anybody, but that virtue got lost in the fog of oblivion those years. I was quick to tell everyone I'd converted, and of course I got a lot of good response right away. The respect I got out of my rap songs was nothing compared to this. I'd known since day one that this was the ultimate rite of passage in the hood, but I also knew full well that you can't just call yourself a Muslim. As immature as I'd been throughout the years, I've always been mature enough to know it takes something extra in order to call yourself a Muslim, and it wasn't until this fall that I got to this point of maturity in life in order to finally convert. But on the other hand, it was Islam that made me so suddenly mature. No doubt it would have done quite the same for me anytime sooner, I thought. It was like I woke up from a lifelong trance, a lifelong fog. In such a short time I went from like a 13-year-old soccer kid to a 30-year-old family man. It wasn't until now that I truly became an adult. I realized just how immature and lost I'd really been my whole life. It wasn't until now I realized much of what had been wrong all along, and came to the conclusion that the problem and the solution had always lied within me much rather than external circumstances. It wasn't until now that I truly found some peace, even though I also had much more to be, quote, bitter about. But I was able not to drown in bitterness this time. I only became optimistic about all the new opportunities to change, show, and prove. About 1-2 weeks later, I bumped into this woman downtown by coincidence. We talked for about an hour. I asked her some previously planned out questions and also answered them myself. Later, she suggested we would meet downtown. It resulted in me eating a bag of peanuts for lunch while walking around waiting for hours. Later I suggested we would go to the movies and watch the French movie, Girlhood, just to minimize the risk that she would go see it without me. She reacted positively to the suggestion, but it never happened neither. We kept chatting, but then around Christmas or New Year, she started to turn away, saying, "Don't think it's about a relationship," and such. One Friday night in late October, while at home getting high, something real ugly happened. I started having pornographic thoughts, totally unexpected and beyond my control right now. It had nothing to do with any specific person, let alone the woman I'd just met. On top of that, I also fainted sometime during November at the job, while standing in front of a computer at recess, at a high table without a chair. This actually happened after I'd started calling myself a Muslim. I fell all the way backwards unconscious for a few seconds, hitting the head to the ground, and then I got to walk home. I might add I was also logged in on Facebook, and had to log out after the faint. Since then, I've never once again logged in on Facebook nor Instagram at work. Of course my parents got to find out about the faint soon later and suggested I went to the clinic, but I was scared I would get caught at a blood test. Now I know I wouldn't have done that. I came up with all kinds of reasons for this happening, even for myself, but now I can actually tie this to the weed. This also happened a few weeks later at work, but then I sat in front of the computer fortunately. I never stood in front of the computer ever again. I sat still in the chair, full of cold sweat and death anxiety. I became pretty much normal again after about 5 minutes. But paradoxically, I must tie my quote, conversion, to the weed, which I know another convert from Umeå has done. Consequently, I saw Islam and cannabis as real synonymous throughout 2015. On top of talking to this woman, the weed might have made me fall in love, not unlike ecstasy. Maybe there was even some in the weed. Then it was also that I got cocky because of it, not only the intoxication but also being by default criminal. Of course the woman and Islam made me even more cocky. The weed was also obviously behind all the music, most of which were written from scratch, I put out soon later, since cannabis is known for making people creative, triggering lyrics and such. I'm convinced a lot of people wouldn't have been rappers hadn't it been for their cannabis use, but of course you can do just fine without it growing up in the hood, put aside peer pressure maybe, much more so than I at least. The winter of 2015. For Christmas, I was given 3 books I had wished for, all of them autobiographies by Swedish rappers. Life, by Ken Ring, Sometimes You Just Wanna Disappear, by Doggy Doggelito, and When I Had Nothing, by Ison from rap duo Ison and Fille. I was deeply touched, yeah, almost teary-eyed, when I read about how Ken Ring reunited with his maternal relatives in Kenya after having met them only once 13-14 years ago when he was there to bury his mother who died of cancer when he was only 14. They welcomed him with open arms, and his description of Kenya, and its comparison to Sweden, made very much sense to my comparison between whites and non-whites in Sweden. The people there are more down to earth. They're not destroyed by all the pop culture and technology despite, or better yet thanks to, the extreme poverty. Although a lot of people are actually just living simple. They got what they need. Back in junior high, I dreamed about one beautiful day being accepted by a racialized family. And now when I'd been talking to this woman, I started seeing some real opportunities here. This would become more physically real not much later, but for the same reason a nightmare I couldn't have had in my sleep. I returned to Dragon during January after having thought about it for a short time, but after about 2 weeks I got kicked out by a school guard. Dragon had recently had plenty of unlawful visits, not illegal though, which was well known, so I wasn't surprised. There had also been a huge fight that got filmed and reported, which involved kids from other schools. In this case primarily whites who couldn't keep their mouths shut, or keep the cameras down. Another reminder of what I learned back in high school: you can't trust white folks. I'd felt like my days were numbered anyway. But that was okay cause I had thought about leaving Dragon once again, so I was only glad to not have to make the decision all by myself now. My bygone quote, dog years, there were written on my future gravestone much like Midgård. During the same month, I started praying, but only once a day though. I wrote my own manual based on all the information I found, practiced on it, and eventually I had learned how to pray by myself. I also learned the Al-Fatiha, the opening Quran chapter included in the prayer, in Arabic. Then I prayed once a day until April. Then I started praying only once every Friday. I'll get back to why later. But then about 3-4 weeks later, I started praying daily again. It wasn't until Ramadan in mid-June that I started praying 5 times a day like supposed to. I visited Umeå's mosque in downtown for the first time on the Friday of February 20th, which is really just a section of a building with several different sections. People had suggested it a number of times, but it wasn't until after I'd been shown the building that I finally went there, now when I knew where it was located. First I sat there with everyone else in the direction towards Mecca, to the southeast, listening to the imam, our equivalent of priest, while he spoke in Arabic for about an hour. After we all had executed the prayer, the imam asked me to step forward, to my surprise. We'd shaken hands earlier and I got to tell him I became a Muslim last November. Now I got to tell everybody else quickly I was a new Muslim. Then I got to walk around hugging people. It was like the ultimate family reunion, not so different from the one Ken Ring got to experience. Then I visited the mosque about once a month until Ramadan, when I started being there every Friday. It became like Dragon's successor, alternatively a new youth center, haha. During January, I took a look around Marihem Lives, a small Arab-owned shop at Marihem which opened during the winter of 2014. I'd been there 3 to 5 times earlier, without buying anything there though. But now I decided to start buying almonds there, in exchange for cashews at ICA, the mainstream grocery store right across the block. I also took a look at other products and considered replacing more ICA products, in order to save money and/or transfer my outcome to Marihem Lives. I didn't find nothing else there to buy until further notice. Soon later, I also dropped by Crid Hillen at Oldham, for the 3rd time maybe. That place had been there for much longer. There I found a bag of brown bulgur, which I didn't at Lives, and then I decided to try it actually, replacing the rice at ICA. Then I replaced the ICA pasta with red lentils, which I found at both places. Later I realized lentils were actually protein and not starch, so then I had to quit them for that reason. Lentils did become of course one more protein source like my other ones. I had since the last summer wanted to buy at these shops on a regular, hence the term, support your locals, which I proudly but idiotically associated with buying weed from my homies. So now it was about time I started doing this. Then during Ramadan, I started buying dates at Lives, and then in November I replaced all the ICA meat with Lives meat, all of which was also halal slaughtered. As of early 2017, Lives made up to about 6,500 crowns of my outcome, around 930 to 1080 US dollars, and Crid Hillen about 4,000 crowns, about $570 to $670. I also saved several thousand crowns a year as a result of that at the time. Alhamdulillah, all praise is due to God. During mid-January, I did something I had considered for the last month, and it was very much because I wanted to impress the woman that I finally made the decision. I bought a ticket to an Immortal Technique concert that would take place in Tradgården in Gothenburg on the Saturday of February 21st. He would also perform in Stockholm the Thursday before and then Malmö the Friday after. The Saturday in Gothenburg was an easy choice since it wouldn't affect my job. I'd also never been in Gothenburg before, so I looked forward to visiting that city. For the coming weeks, I got busy booking flight tickets, the hostel, and then planning out the whole weekend there. Shortly before I went to Gothenburg, a homie suggested, one weekend night downtown, that I should have my key bunch in my jacket pocket instead of around my neck. Right there and then, or shortly thereafter, I myself came up with the idea of having the key bunch as a weapon, and thus replace the spray with it. Since I was about to jump on an airplane and then visit probably the most dangerous city in Sweden at the time, I got a little paranoid about the spray. Should I bring it or not? Can I have it on the plane? Can I have it in the pocket and bring it through the search? But now all of that was gone out of my brain. I also figured I could have had it as a weapon ever since I started high school, or even as soon as I left Brentis 2 months prior. I already had it 24/7 and I couldn't exactly buy a spray and much less hide it at home back in those days. I also figured that Thomas Uberg, one half of the twin duo Block 44 from Umeå, had a very obvious key necklace in the videos for Greater Perspective and Identity Ice Cold, among others, both of which I saw back in 2007-2008 already. That's something I really should have noticed I don't know how long ago. I also might add that one line out of the song, Lost, the courthouse deals out a prison sentence, should have actually made me find the courthouse much earlier also. That way, I would have much less likely ended up in such a stressful situation in 2012-13, for which Alex Jones became the main scapegoat for a period. I went around with a screwdriver a little around 2009 and 10. Idiotically, I had it only during school time, never in the night. I tried having it in my pant pocket a few times, but that clearly didn't work. Having it in the backpack clearly worked much better. But then it would take way too long time to react, pulling it out that is, if something would happen. My father also found it in the backpack one time and then of course we got into an argument. I might add though that I brought it successfully into the police station during the summer of 2009 when I was there to fix my passport in preparation for the New York trip. On top of that, Block 44 and the screwdriver should have made me take up the keys during high school, when those girls' male friends clearly posed a threat. During the fall of 2012, I found an old case in the courthouse where a friend had whooped somebody with a key bunch. One of the books I borrowed the last summer was written by a cop and was about self-defense. He suggested the key bunch but dismissed the spray, the exact one that got me kicked out of 5, since the perpetrator could snatch it out of your hand. At the same time, I figured that from now on I could easily get stopped and searched by the cops without getting caught with a weapon, since I wouldn't have a spray and that the keys would be just as normal as the wallet and the phone. It's meant for locking things up, not hurting people. I could have easily been grabbed by that undercover cop at 5 without getting kicked out thanks to the keys. Then I would have avoided a whole lot of unnecessarily self-imposed anger and fear of the cops the previous year, let alone this one and the other one who showed up. Since then, I've felt much safer now since I don't gotta worry about anything if the cops were to stop and search me. The other side of the law also posed a much smaller threat now since I was much more respected, and had also survived unhurt after all the music and information I'd put out on the internet. I felt safe enough on that note already here, after having realized my old mistakes and cleaned up after myself so successfully. Then on February 21st, I left off from Umeå Airport at 11:40. I had to give up a plastic water bottle to my surprise at the customs, but right after I got to learn it was to prevent me from bringing in explosives. The customs should have explained it though, I think I also asked why. But I got to keep the keys, even after having put it in that box with all the other stuff, necklace, wallet, phone, belt etc. Then I landed on Landvetter Airport right outside Gothenburg at 14:20. I had lunch there at sports bar/restaurant O'Leary's, picked a free map of the city and then took the bus to the city. It was rainy and or overcast, and as far as I remember it was above 32 Fahrenheit and no snow whatsoever. I got to the hostel at Vega Street, around 4 p.m. and then left the place 60 to 90 minutes later. I had dinner at Indian restaurant Vasatika, where I was surprised and disappointed I wasn't served any vegetables. Then I arrived at Tradgården around 7 shortly after the entrance had opened. Shortly after having walked in, I placed myself at the fence right in front of the scene waiting for the concert that begun at around 9. Immortal Technique performed together with Poison Pen, Hassan Salam and Constant Flow, the two latter who are signed to Tech's own label Viper Records. After the concert, I and many other spectators got to take selfies with them. My selfie with Immortal Technique got 25 likes on Facebook. I left the place at around 1-2 a.m., probably 3 hours later than expected. Since I missed the last trolley, or better yet didn't know which one to take, I had to walk all the way to the hostel. I walked probably 30 minutes through downtown, and I probably lost about 30 more minutes by getting lost. Real empty and real dangerous. On the way I found Tintin, a restaurant that was open 24/7 literally, and where about 90% of those that ate there were racialized. I woke up around 10 a.m. and went straight to Landvetter, left off at 1 p.m. and landed on Bromma Airport in Stockholm at 2. I got to eat Thai duck breast combined with an Italian salad buffet. Then I left off at 4 p.m. and came home at 10 minutes past 5. On March 26, I received rapper Seba Stax's new autobiography, The Music, The Crimes, The Addiction, after having ordered it on the internet. His real name's Sebastian Staxet, and he was the lead member of Kartellen. Now when I got to read about his life in detail, I was real surprised and impressed to see how alike we really were. His bitter description of elementary fit my description of junior high real good. He never had any ASP diagnose and nor did he ever go to any special class, but the way he described himself as a child, he actually showed symptoms that reminded me of that. And even though I wasn't severely bullied, enough to compare to him, that is, until the end of junior high, the constant loneliness and fear was exactly the same from day one. That in combination with the fact that he was also bullied by teachers really helped me come to terms with everything. It couldn't be more true that misery needs company. I remember when I first got to hear about Kartellen, the cartel, through MySpace during 2008 and 9. That's where it all started for them. At the time I couldn't relate one bit to their lyrics about grand robberies, automatic weapons, bulletproof vests etc., not even after having learned to relate to American rappers like Tupac. His emotionality and humility reached me way better than Kartellen's braggadocio and narcissism. But now in 2015 I could relate to Kartellen much better, not only because I knew who Seba Stax actually is but also because their later music is somewhat more humble than its predecessor, about poverty, drug addiction, broken families, politics etc. Imagine if I already back in 2008 or 9 had known who Seba Stax was. He was anonymous though back then. That really would have helped considering all these haters who used my middle-class background against me, plus my Alex Jones addiction and my historically poor relationship to other white role models. He did grow up in Bagarmossen, a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Stockholm, but his parents weren't much different from mine. Put aside lower income, plus that his father was strongly left-wing and also anti-police, they were practically average Joes with a summer cabin at Gotland, an island a bit south of Stockholm, and such. I had already learned since far back not to be ashamed of my middle-class parents, but since Seba Stax actually grew up working class, I don't think his family status would have helped much during junior high. Back then, it would have really been Petter, Jacob Holt and Block 44. But the fact that he had all these ASP symptoms should have worked though. One word he used sometimes in his book and that got quite stuck in my mind was prison damaged. I felt very much like prison damaged at this point after having lived like I had since early October as a result of my empty job situation and Dragon being out of the game. Lonely, bored and a little bitter, but also more disciplined, exercised and religious. I'd been pretty much stripped off of everything. I felt like some kind of skeleton. My whole life had passed through in review several times, both the past and the future, whatever the future had to offer. Allah had really turned me inside out, I believed. It had really been a quote, regret and struggle, taken from Kartellen's 2 latest albums, which I could also say about the rest of 2015. Since this winter, I had pretty much relapsed into depression, but much weaker and much more productive than 2011. Above being better off now than then. Now I made much more daily changes to actually make life better instead of just sinking helplessly. I was real impressed how the book was written, how he described things. He was helped though by professional author Nicholas Malmborg, but either way, it was almost like reading the Bible, which I'd never done. This book was clearly the best out of all these 4 I'd read now since Christmas. During the last 6 months, I'd been to a number of basketball games, twice a month, at the Gamaliel Hall, where there had been basketball games regularly since the last fall. One of the Frassers was also there mad often, I noticed. During January, we happened to walk past each other, and then he pushed me on the chest slightly. I quietly said, "Don't touch me fuckboy," and then or soon later that evening I came up with an idea. I was gonna find him and whoop him, at his bus stop and or street on the east side of Eresbuda. Enough that he should have stopped messing around right away in the spring of 2013. It should have also ended now after an incident we had in the fall of 2014 on Eresbuda's basketball court. He happened to be there with 10 plus other dudes I already knew, and I don't mean Frassers. I pointed him out in front of the whole crew about previous incidents and he got down on his knees for a brief second and said, sorry, anxiously. I can remember him doing it a second time as well. However, he stayed with us for a while and then left while we stayed a bit longer. But I had also just started feeling ashamed of my old behavior, towards both him and everybody else I had beefed with. I also felt increasingly compelled to live up to my lyrics, as well as many other people's lyrics, whether I had bidden, meaning borrowed, them or not. I felt that I'd been too much a, quote, studio gangster, in recent years, that I had talked the talk but not walked the walk. I was also inspired by certain passages in Ken Ring's and Seba Stack's autobiographies. Actually, I was only doing the right thing in previous years by trying to avoid violence. But now that I had simply behaved so poorly, I just felt so compelled to make up for it, show what I was going for, take it to that level. I thought he was so easily accessible because he lived in East Earsbuda of all places, unlike those small-town whites. It would turn out he was very accessible, but equally it would turn out to be a mission completely impossible. I also saw a fight at Dragon, in the middle of the hallway, during January or February. There happened to be only 2 random whites there at the moment, besides the homies of course. Nothing happened after that. No one got reported, arrested or even charged. I left the school immediately after the fight, scarred and numb, terrified of being interrogated as a witness, but otherwise looking forward to the opportunity to keep my mouth shut, of course. In addition to the fact that I now suddenly had so much less to lose by getting caught compared to only 6 months ago, given my life situation as I've described it, I saw for the first time a very high probability of actually getting away with a crime completely. Until then, I saw an extremely low probability of getting away with any crime at all, with the exception of the weed of course. Until recently, I'd seriously believed that the verdicts in the courthouse accounted for about 90% of all crimes ever committed, but now I'd realized they accounted for perhaps only half. I also saw an opportunity for the first time to be labeled legally sane in court, meaning normal, responsible, if I was to be convicted. Up until then, I'd been terrified of getting locked up in a psychiatric facility and being force-fed pills and shit if I was to be convicted of something, and rightfully so. At least I was normal enough to understand that, and now that I became this normal, I saw an opportunity to be classified as normal by the legal system, by society. Being classified as normal by the hood, I'd already easily fixed with the help of Facebook and Insta. The spring and summer of 2015. I kept talking to this girl quite often during this winter, but it never led to anything bigger. Then during February or March, she stopped answering me completely, and as a result, I tried to start chats less often gradually until she finally during late March said, "We'll never be together. Do you understand me?" Then I gave up completely, and as impatient and naive as I was, I cut down on the prayers out of pure disappointment. I already knew actually you can't have everything at once, and that you can't demand the quote, perfect result if you can't appreciate the result you already get along the way. I just lost, and played, meaning embarrassed, myself simply. Actually I should have started praying 5 times a day from there. That would have been a whole lot more logical, regardless if I would have gotten closer to her or not. I got too dependent on her simply. I was also a donkey for writing on Facebook something like, "I've never felt so betrayed all of my life," although without telling anything about a relationship. I also put out some angry outbursts earlier this winter, but I had recently started to clean up my act, started to realize how vain and annoying that was. I also learned not to get angry at small stuff even within myself silently, realizing now how unnecessary that was. But that came about more likely by itself since life got so much better than shortly before. This woman breaking up with me like that obviously gave this spring a sour start. She was obviously the very best aspect of the last fall and winter. But I still had really looked forward to this spring and summer, much due to my conversion and thus that I would get to execute my very first Ramadan this summer. That made it a much lesser problem that the woman left the picture. I also got to choose which weeks I would have my summer vacation, and then I easily chose the Ramadan weeks and the 2 weeks after that. I was off work week 26 to 31, from the Friday of June 19th, Midsummer Eve, to the Sunday of August 2nd. I was totally right in that this would be an extraordinary spring and summer, but I didn't expect all this. I can start with saying I was invited to other people's apartments, usually by coincidence, 6 times this spring and summer. I wasn't invited one time in 2014 and only once in 2013. In 2012, I was invited 3 times despite riding around the hood less often due to ICSU. As usual, it all happened in Oldham, but with one exception for Marihem this time. For the first time, I was invited to someone else's apartment there, put aside my paternal grandparents who had lived there my whole life. Now I only had yet to be invited somewhere in Earsbuda. Otherwise, I got much more out of Marihem this spring and summer than before, which is obviously because I rode through Marihem Street, the projects and the mall on the east side, both to and from Earsbuda, unlike previously when I rode through Brentis, located among the row houses on the west side, on my way to Earsbuda. In Earsbuda, it was mainly the basketball court like usual, just a little more often this time. Oldham though became very very different than previous springs and summers. Just like I expected the last fall, I hardly ever stopped by the soccer court, unlike previous spring and summers when that's where I usually stayed. Now it was pretty much everywhere else, mainly the mall and or just the neighborhood as a whole. I also got to visit the mosque, also just a small section of a building, there like 5 times, never by myself though this summer. This one and the one downtown were the 2 of the few mosques found in Umeå. I also met older and same-aged people much more often than previous springs and summers, in all hoods. But I noticed the difference especially in Oldham. I was like I had landed back to the late 00s. It was like I got to relive that period in a way. I felt that Oldham really should have been like this for me every spring and summer. During my next last joint, on the long Friday of April 3rd, I filmed myself in front of the bathroom mirror for 18 minutes flat. I'd planned on sooner or later creating a Facebook group in order to share the video, just to brag vainly about my cannabis use. I had my very last joint on the Friday of May 15th, I think. I drowned in certain traumatic junior high school memories and became literally suicidal for a few minutes. It had been precisely 3 years since I sunk that low, May 5, 2012. I even held the nail polisher, quite close to stabbing myself. I'd always had it in the bedroom due to my nail-biting addiction I'd had since birth, which I didn't beat completely until perhaps 2019. I had like 3 to 5 times earlier considered quitting the weed, thanks to a lot of rap songs also actually, but this became my turning point. I had 0.4 grams, 2 hits that is, left and about a month later, I threw it away. I also might add I giggled quite a lot even long after the last joint, the last one in question that is, not necessarily the very last one, for example in the morning on my way to work or in physical socialization. I also admit I a few times almost broke into laughter at the mosque, and a few times, until the fall of 2015, accidentally broke into laughter in the middle of the prayer. Right before Ramadan, which started on the Wednesday night of June 17th, I was also finished going through and remastering all my old American rap lyrics, almost 3 months after I started working on it. About 180 songs became 102 from 21 different acts, 45 of the lyrics which came from Tupac. Then I started recording them at a fast rate. I released like 3 to 5 songs at a time. I probably recorded 20 songs during Ramadan, which ended at the Thursday night of July 16th. As much as I'd actually had come closer to the lyrics as they were originally, I had also cut down on exaggerations. I couldn't imagine how well they would fit Sweden as a country 2022. I can assure you the N-word was completely gone. I'd really gone from only talking the talk to actually walking the walk. And as much as I exaggerated, I've realized even more how right I actually had been all along about stuff, let alone the ASP class and its cult atmosphere plus the beef with the girls. The way the lyrics were written now, I could have easily released them during high school without getting into trouble. Back then, I never thought I would be able to describe the beef so good without using insults. On the Saturday of May 9th, I revisited Gävle, Falun, Borlänge and Uppsala. I visited all of these cities during the same day. I kept strictly to downtown in all cities, but in Uppsala I also had time to drop by the well-known hood Gottsunda far down south, which I also got to do in 2013 on my way home from Borlänge actually. I was gonna take the night bus home from Uppsala and then I also got to walk through the lesser-known hood Kvarngärdet right north of downtown since the bus was leaving off from right north of Kvarngärdet. Back to 2015, I spent the first week after Ramadan, week 30, once again, in Stockholm, just like last summer. During May and June 2013 I made 2 similar revisits in the cities I visited in 2012, and then on the Saturday of May 14, 2016 I revisited Västerås and Eskilstuna. On the Friday of August 28, I and about 20 other Muslims of different ages, all males, went to Likibu around 6 p.m. Likibu is a summer camp located a bit northwest of Umeå. We were there until around 5 p.m. on Sunday. While we were there, we got to wake up around 4 a.m. each night to execute the Fajr prayer. We slept otherwise generally from midnight to 8. Eat food usually using flat bread as cutlery, very common in Muslim cultures. Listen to 4 lectures in Swedish, stuff that's very appealing to youth, stuff I wanted to see more often at the mosque. We also held a small soccer tour. I was just the goalkeeper for 2 rounds, and rowed canoes. I rowed a canoe with another guy on the Saturday, which led to us getting stranded on the wrong side of the lake. The wind blew so hard we couldn't row back. At first we walked up to a house hoping someone would drive us back, but it was empty. Then we walked up to another house, but the guy was busy taking care of the kids. Then I tried to lift, but fortunately we got picked up by some other guys from the camp after about 20 minutes without having to contact them. This weekend reminded me strongly of my old family cabin far out in, or better yet far into, the woods, like 4 hours west of Umeå. I remember that bitterish water taste that you just don't find in the city. I was there for a week every summer 2007 to 13, which was my last time there before the cabin got sold. Before that, I'd been there maybe once twice a year, sometimes during the sports holidays in early March. This also became a great ending of this summer, but the coming fall would be the end of the world as I knew it.